I'm Stacy Grinsfelder from Blake Hill House.
And I'm Devyn Caldwell from Our Philly Row. And we're the hosts of True Tales from Old Houses.
Hey there.
Hey, Stacy. How are things going?
Good, good. Any suspicious fevers, sore throats, tightness in your chest?
No, just seasonal allergies, which makes me a little embarrassed to be out when I have the sniffles.
Yeah, does everybody stare at you like, oh, what's wrong with him?
Yeah, well, I haven't been out very much, but just like I take a walk around the park outside and I'll be sniffling at people walking by and, even with my mask on.
Yeah. Do you just walk and say, don't cough, Devyn, don't cough?
No, not really.
Well, I'm actually really happy that, of course, you're not sick. I'm starting to kind of feel like it's a matter of when, not if. I hope that's not the case, but each day I kind of wake up and assess the situation, and so far so good, but I know a lot of people aren't well, and there's a lot of stress in everybody's lives from missed work and lost days and suddenly homeschooling children, and it's a tough time.
It is. I actually had to go in for a small medical procedure this morning. It was the first time I'd been to the hospital in 6 weeks or so. And I have to say, it was a little bit of a dystopian experience. Like the waiting room had all the seats blocked off, every third or fourth seat so you could sit, and everyone wearing a mask.
Right.
Kind of like you'd see in a movie. It was a little odd, but fortunately it was a very quick and simple procedure, and I was in and out in about 25 minutes.
Good. All right. Well, what has been happening in your studio space at Our Philly Row? I know that was something that you started working on recently.
Yesterday Yoav had a day off because his employer was like, as a thank you, gave him the day off. So we got in the car and I went and picked up that amazing drafting table. The drafting table itself it's from the 80s. It's okay. But all the stuff that came with is amazing. When we went and picked it up, he put it out on the driveway. We had to drive about 25 miles way out into the suburbs. And he put it all out on the driveway for social distancing. And I pull up into the driveway and I get out and I start to look a little bit and I'm like, okay, I'm not going to be really obvious here and kind of poke about. I'm just going to take it because I had a sense there's something here. Yoav and I loaded it into the car. And as we're loading it, I'm like, wait, these boxes and drawers, they're not empty. There's stuff in there. I have one what it is. So when I got home, the first thing I did was I dragged them into the house and I opened them up. It's full of like engineering templates, like rapidograph pen sets and pencils and, the French curve. And so all the drafting stuff, there was a 10-karat gold cross pencil in there.
Amazing.
And then the fluorescent light, which I'm not a fan of fluorescent, but this light's kind of so retro and cool. I love it. I looked it up on eBay and it's like $75 on eBay.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. That cross pen's worth like $50. And then the two wooden boxes, the one with the 3 drawers and the other one has that little tilty thing. I'm like, That's so awesome. Who cares about the desk?
It's like one of those episodes of Storage Wars, where they're like,
totally.
Okay, I'll give you $10 for that box, and it could be filled with like dirty rags or it could be filled with some valuable stuff. You never know what it is.
Exactly. So I think it's all from like the 90s and 80s. So I'm guessing that the guy's father was like an engineer maybe.
That's probably been sitting in someone's garage or attic for a long time.
Oh, absolutely. And so he just wanted to get rid of it all and didn't even want to look through it. And I was okay with that.
Well, this week at Blake Hill House, I finally did the stair treads.
Yay.
I finished the stair treads.
I'm not jealous at all.
Oh, no, yeah, I know. I guess you started Stair Project, and then somehow I've managed to take over at my end and start a stair project here.
You pulled ahead in the race, and mine's now on hold for a while, but that's okay.
If this is a race, you still may win because the project here at my house is enormous, and I've only scratched the surface. But I used a new product new to me. It's not a new product. It's called Loba Impact Oil. Really interesting. Very similar to Rubio Monocoat, which you and I discussed in a previous episode, and I'll link that in the show notes. But you apply it the same way. Supposedly, it definitely looks the exact same as the Rubio Monocoat. And it's supposed to wear maybe just a little bit stronger, which is why I chose it on the stair treads. The likelihood of me refinishing these stairs, well, there's probably almost no likelihood of refinishing this again. So I kind of wanted a one and done, whereas all the other floors will need to be done at some point.
Right.
And I was looking for a really long-lasting, authentic-looking product, and it's pretty good stuff. I'm happy with it. I wrote a blog post this week about using it, and I will also link to it, both the episode where we talked about floors and the Loba. information. Well, anyway, that is pretty much all that's happening here at my house. So let's turn to announcements. Something happened pretty recently, and I want you to tell us about it. It was kind of exciting.
I discovered savingplaces.org, which is a website for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, did a post 11 great podcasts for historic preservation fans, and we are on that list.
We are on that list. That's so exciting.
It is.
There are a lot of, there are 10 other podcasts on there, some that I had heard of, including your favorite, 99% Invisible.
Yep, love that show.
And then there were a few that I hadn't heard of. So I just want to say many thanks to author Nicholas Sam for including True Tales from Old Houses in the roundup. And we'll link it over on the show notes so you can read about all the other podcasts in the article. Like I said, many of them were new to me, and I think that you're going to want to add them to your listening queue too. I know that I can't get enough of historic preservation talk.
Same here.
Big news, big news. I guess it's time to move on to our listener Q&A. The question that we have today came to us through Instagram. She actually sent me a personal message and I said, "Hey, did you just want my answer or do you want me to answer this on the podcast?" And she said, "Either." And I thought, you know what? This is a really good podcast question. So why don't you take it away, Devyn?
It is a great question. The question is, how do you choose a color scheme for a large house?
All right. And one thing I did not clarify was, I'm not sure if this question was meant for the inside of the house or the exterior of the house. So we're going to talk about both. And Devyn, I think you're going to handle the interior.
Yeah, I'll talk about the inside.
All right, go for it.
Sure. I think first we'll focus on paint because I think paint is the driver of a color scheme. And there's other factors in that, which I'll get to in just a second. And before I dive into that, I think we should talk about those who are really preservation-minded, looking at preserving or restoring their old house to what it really was at one time.
Right. I agree, because I don't actually know, this question was pretty generic, but it's worth taking both sides. The preservation side and the, hey, I'm just living in my house and living the dream side.
I mean, if you are in a house, and, let's face it, not all old houses are necessarily preservation worthy in the same sense as others. But I think if you have a home where you're really trying to get back to the original, there's a lot of ways you can do that. You can have paint layers analyzed to determine original colors, and that can be done through sending samples to a laboratory. Sometimes you can find the original color yourself just with a bit of scraping or tucked behind a piece of trim.
Right.
And or in a closet. So there's a lot of different ways you can find out. And the service is available for wallpaper too. A lot of times when you're working in an old house, you'll discover some old wallpaper, and that can also be hunted down to discover what it was.
I'm fascinated by this idea of taking a scraping. Some of those apartments might have 10 or 12 layers of paint, taking a little scraping and sending it off to the lab where they analyze it and figure out what the color was and probably the closest match to that first color. I think that would be so neat. I don't happen to have that much paint on our house, which is actually lucky, but it would be cool.
Well, an advantage of a lab too is that they'll have the knowledge and skill set to determine what the color was, not just by looking at it, but by analyzing the chemical breakdown. And one thing to remember is paint changes over time, especially oil-based. So you might be looking at an ivory, but maybe it was a white when they painted it.
Good point.
Lab would be able to help you with that information as well.
Sure.
Speaking of paint and kind of the other side of this, for those of us who want to kind of just do what we want to do in our houses, the first thing I want to say is paint is like the best bang for the buck. For under $100, you can transform a room completely and fairly quickly. And it's also a way to explore colors that you may be a little afraid of because, it's just paint. You can paint a room again if it's really, if you do a color and you're like, I don't like this. You can paint it again for under $100. I think that that's really one of the greatest ways you can create a space that is personalized for you.
Right. How do you choose, though?
Well, before you start looking at paint colors, you need to understand a few other things. You need to know your fixed elements. Your hardwood floors or unpainted trim or cabinets, or if you're in the kitchen or next to the kitchen, kitchen cabinets, wall tile, countertops. Those are your fixed elements, and they're not likely to change. And so you need to kind of take those into consideration. Are the undertones of the floor, of your wood floor, warm or cool? Do you have orange tones or do you have green tones? So you kind of need to understand that before you start out, because that's a pretty big consideration. Because you want your paint to work with those colors. You don't want them to fight.
Right.
It's amazing how if you choose the wrong color and it's fighting with an orangey wood floor, how both will look terrible.
Sure.
The other consideration is if you have like open plan, like modern homes will oftentimes have the kitchen, dining room, and living room is all kind of within one space. And so they could theoretically all have all one wall.
Right.
And so that makes it a little more challenging, and you kind of want to have to go with the same throughout, in my opinion.
If you've had an old house that's received the HGTV treatment, then you'll kind of have to do the maybe one color.
Yes, exactly. But in old houses, you also, like our house, for example, has a continuation of space. We have the reception hall. When you walk in the front door and through the vestibule, you walk into this hallway, which connects the parlor and the dining room in the back and the staircase. And that staircase goes up to the second and third floor, and all the hallways up there. So it's all actually connected. It's the same space on 3 levels.
Right.
So we're planning on using the same color from the ground floor to the top floor to make it cohesive when you walk up and down the stairs.
All right. That makes sense.
And then for choosing a color scheme, I find interestingly, first of all, you want to go with what your overall feeling is, and your favorite color should come into play as well. And again, don't be afraid of color. It's just paint. But I find Pinterest to be an excellent place to start. To just go through photos and pin photos that grab your attention. And then you can start to see a pattern develop when you start to look at your pin boards. Like, what colors am I gravitating towards? Those are the colors you should use in your home.
Okay.
Whether or not you think they're the right. I mean, like if you're gravitating towards certain blue tones, then absolutely make that a primary underlying. You don't use the same blue in every room, but you can use a variation of it. I think that's the best way to kind of come up with a scheme. And then on individual rooms, people tend to like the light and bright and white rooms, which is fine. Mm-hmm. And I tend to be more of the dark and moody, cozy. I like a kind of a dark and cozy, moody room. I don't know why. It just makes me feel really comfortable.
Well, you're kind of dark and moody.
So I've been told. It must be I think it's the introvert in me, and everyone thinks that I'm so very serious, and I'm so not as serious as people
You're
think
not
I
serious. You're not serious. You're not as emo as your paint choices.
True. Very true. I will say that I tend to lean towards monochromatic color schemes in the same room. And there's kind of 2 different ways I handle it. I will paint all the walls and trim and the ceiling. And the thing about the ceiling is your 5th wall.
Right.
People tend to ignore the ceiling and leave it white. And in my mind, that's a disconnect. I mean, it means you forgot the ceiling. And
sure.
So I tend to paint all the walls and ceilings the same color. And then what I'll do is I'll do a flat paint on the walls, and I'll do like an eggshell on the trim. And that sets it off. And what's interesting is it can be the same color, but the 2 different sheens looks like 2 separate colors that are connected.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
That slight sheen reflects light differently, so it gives you the look of 2 separate colors, even though they're the same color. The other method I'll do, which I'm planning on doing in our parlor, is I'm going with a green, but I want the trim to be 2 shades different. So I took the color chip, can't say that word, from the store, and I went 2 colors over, and it happens to be Avon green. I'm going to do my trim in Avon green and the walls and ceiling in Caldwell green. Pure coincidence, it's my last name, but
right.
That's what it is. The 2 colors being so close on the color wheel, they will correlate with each other as well. And you'll have a little more depth that you wouldn't expect. It'll look the same initially, but then there's like a depth when you spend time in a space.
I think to summarize what you've said so far, it would be to, if you're historic minded, that's kind of a different situation altogether. But
right.
if you are choosing from scratch, just something that you like, maybe figure out your undertones first in the room of your fixed elements, then pin a bunch of things that you like on Pinterest and discover the pattern, and then go from there in choosing colors for your house. Is that about right?
Yeah, exactly. And, in our case, each room will be different, but they relate to each other. And so, like, in our case, like, the reception hall is going to be different than the parlor, but I'll have accessories in the parlor that match the color of the reception hall, so it ties them together because there's a big double doorway between the 2 rooms. There's a visual connection between the 2 spaces.
I can see it. I think that's going to look lovely.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's going to be a little while, but I'm excited about getting there.
I'm actually learning quite a lot just talking about this with you today. You've got my gears turning now. I'm like, oh, Oh, that's how you do that. All right. So maybe there's hope for me yet in I have my three main spaces downstairs, dining room, foyer, living room, and they are kind of a disjointed mess. Yes.
There's absolute hope. And you don't have to be dark and moody like me. You can do the same thing with light colors.
Yeah. Well, I just want to make it clear that I like you just the way you are.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So I guess I'll take the exterior because you've never had to choose exterior paints. Your house is brick and you've lived in apartments.
That's true. And although we will have to repaint the trim on our house at some point, that's not on our agenda at the moment. So we'll get to that when we get to that. It's the ugly beige that it came with, and we'll get there.
And trim is only a small fraction of the amount of paint for when you're considering the exterior of a house. So the question was, of course, how do you pick a color scheme for a large house? And it just so happens that I have a very large house that needed to be entirely painted within the first 3 years that I lived here. And it was a very stressful decision because the house originally was dark green with light green trim, was not historically accurate in any way. It was also neither color I would have chosen. So it wasn't attractive to me enough that I would just repaint it the same color. So I didn't get to lean on that crutch of like, well, I like it, so I might as well just repaint it. So we were going completely from scratch, and I was stumped because it's a very expensive project.
Oh, yes, it is, especially on the outside.
Right. And you talk about making mistakes. These aren't $100 mistakes. These are tens of thousands of dollar mistakes. And so I sat on the question for a really long time. And what I did was I ended up driving around. I live in an area with tons of historic houses. So I would drive from town to town and look at the way other people painted their very large houses. And it didn't really give me an idea of what I wanted, but it gave me an idea of what I did not want. That's kind of a negative point of view. And I don't mean that. I think they're very lovely houses, and I'm always really fond of people who will take a big risk, but I wasn't willing to take a big risk with our house. So I ended up finding the exterior color. I was on a trip to Indiana. We were in the same neighborhood as Andy's parents. They live in a historic neighborhood. And we were walking down the street, and somebody had moved into a house and they were doing complete overhaul of this old house. And it was exactly what I wanted. I looked at it and I thought, that's it. That would look so beautiful. That's what I want. Andy's parents, kind of trotted over to the neighbors and asked them what color that paint was and sent me a message to tell me. And it ended up being a different brand of paint than I planned on using. So then I used Benjamin Moore paint, which I'm not compensated, but I love their stuff. I went to the Benjamin Moore store and looked at their historic color fan card and chose a blue that was very, very close. And that's how I ended up with a Hail Navy on the exterior. And then I picked a white or off-white. It's kind of a creamy white from their historic fan deck as well.
Yeah.
And that's what we ended up with.
So instead of Pinterest, you drove around and looked at everything. So that's not Pinterest, but it's really the same thing as you're looking at external sources and kind of learning what you like and what you don't like.
Right.
I do know what it's like, though, when you find something and you're like, ooh, that's it. I like that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. For a long time, like I said, I was in that sort of negative space of, ooh, I definitely don't want that. But then when I saw that what I wanted, I thought, I know it. That's it. It's going to look beautiful. I really needed to see what these things looked like on a large scale. Because I had ideas of things that I thought, but if it were left to me, I would have painted it white. And how terrible would that have been? The most boring white, beautiful big house on the block. And it would have been green with mold or brown with gray with mold in 3 years' time. And I would have spent my entire life pressure washing the thing. So,
right.
But anyway, so that is how I did it, right or wrong. That's how I made that decision. But there are ways, if you are more preservation leaning, and you really want to pick a historically accurate color, there are some really good resources for you. And
there are.
Yeah, there are style guides from specific periods. A couple that I can think of. There's one called Victorian Exterior Decoration, How to Paint Your 19th Century American House Historically. And that's by Roger Moss and Gail Caskey-Winkler. Roger Moss actually wrote another book about the history of paint. We'll link those on the show notes too. But you can look
I need to
at
read
these.
that.
Yeah, you can look at these publications. There's also seems to be a bunch of books about painting bungalows. Bungalows get a lot of love in the world as far
They
as
do.
how to paint
Well,
them
there's
and how to
there's
treat
good
them.
reason for that.
They're cozy and sweet, so I can understand that. Definitely.
And often dark.
And often dark, and maybe a little moody, just maybe a little moody. Yeah. On Google, if you go to Google Books, kind of a preview of these publications, sometimes you'll get the information you need. Sometimes you can find out where to buy that book or look at that. And they'll talk about those historically accurate colors. If you live near a historic district, there may be a more regional style guide available through your local preservation organization. You know, maybe there's a bunch of houses and they were all painted a similar color at one point, and you'd like to kind of match that. That's more of a regional difference. The other idea, of course, is to research the paint and pigments available when your house was built. And that's what made me think of that History of Paint book by Roger Moss, because if there were only green and black available during the time when your house was built, then it's very unlikely that your house is going to be hot pink.
This is very true. And I think people don't really understand that there was a rather limited color palette, especially in the 19th century.
Right.
The bright colors that we see in paint today, when you go to the paint store, that really came about in the last 75 years or so. And paint coming in a can the way we buy it today is also not as old as you might think. A lot of times, and especially in the 19th century and prior, you bought a pigment and then you mixed it up yourself with some type of an oil.
Sure.
And so it was kind of a make it yourself kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. I just find it so interesting. But yeah, so a little detective work can kind of narrow down your choices. Then you're not looking at an entire paint store's paint chip samples. You are narrowing it down to just a few options that were available at that time. And it makes it easier, less decision making overall. But once you do decide on your potential color scheme, most of the big brands do have a historic color palette that you can choose from. And there are several website tools too where you can upload a picture of your house or your room or whatnot and try on these different colors. It's not a perfect system, but it is helpful, I find, to try something like that now and then. All right. Oh, also, don't forget your library. Your library may have some resources for you. I always like to put in a plug for the library. And even now, while you're stuck at home, if you have a library card, most libraries now have an online system where you can read ebooks. So maybe you'll find exactly what you're looking for that way. Don't forget the library. You know, we do love these listener questions. So if you have a question and you would like Devyn and I to answer it on the show, then go ahead and submit it through the contact form at truetalesfromoldhouses.com. We went over that pretty thoroughly today. That's almost a show.
Nah, I know. It really actually is.
Yeah, there was a lot to say. That question ended up being bigger than I expected.
Maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. Today kicks off the field trip series that my friend Drew and I recorded way back in February, which feels like a lifetime ago since we were all pretty much in self-isolation by March, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nuts. I mean, he and I talk about it. Drew's local to me, so he and I talk about it sometimes, and we're like, I can't believe that we went on that field trip and it wasn't even on our radar. But I took that trip without you because you were still on medical leave, and I'm very excited because hopefully we're going to put field trips into our seasonal lineup. However, and you and I will go together this time, the next time.
Yes.
Yeah. We're not sure where we're going. We kind of have a little list going of places that we might end up. And we just have to kind of wait until all of this coronavirus and situation settles and we figure out what the world looks like after that. I guess we're all kind of in flux right now.
We're even talking about a trip to the West Coast.
We are talking about a trip to the West Coast.
Yeah,
it's going to be...
That would be fun.
Oh my gosh, it's going to be fun. But this was a little closer to home, at least for me. Not for you, but a little closer to home for me. And Drew and I took a very quick road trip to New Albany, Indiana, and Louisville, Kentucky. And when I say Louisville, Kentucky, I was there for 2 hours. So I can say that I've been there, but that was the first time I've been to Louisville, Kentucky. And I was only there for 2 hours. I would love to go back. Incredibly rich history. And I just found myself kind of looking out the car window like, oh, I wish I could go see that. Oh, I wish I could stop and see that too. But we were definitely on a schedule. Next 2 full episodes will be these field trip episodes. There'll be some video that I'll be sharing with you. Not today's episode, but starting next week, there are some videos that support our next guest. All right, so let's get started with this field trip series, and my guest today is Rhonda Deeg. She's a decorative glass restorer. She was a lot of fun to sit down and talk with. She has so many stories, and she's done so many things, including working at Taliesin. You'll see.
Okay, I'm Rhonda Deeg, RLD Glass Art and Restoration, and I'm based out of Southeast Indiana right now.
I wanted to talk with you in particular because you have a special skill that isn't common, and that is stained glass restoration, actually all glass restoration. Mm-hmm. I wondered if you would like to tell me a little bit about how you got started. You've got your finger on the pulse of this restoration network, and I'd like to find out more about you.
Well, it isn't that it isn't uncommon. There are companies all across the United States. So I want to say that first, because if this is all out there, they're going to think that I'm the only one. That's not true.
Okay.
There are major firms all across the United States that do stained glass restoration. But it's very uncommon for maybe a one-person business. I'm the sole owner. I do the book work, the quote work, right from the start, going out on the job, looking at the job, all the way to the end and installing. So maybe that is where, it becomes more of a specialized thing for me.
Right. When did you get started?
Long time ago, probably 30 years ago. I started by taking just a typical class like a lot of people do. They're just interested in it. Let's go take a craft class at a stained glass place, and that's what I did. Just took off from there.
Right. Did it take off because you found that you really had a passion for the work, or did people say, oh, Rhonda knows what she's doing, let's ask her?
Well, I could give you the long story or the short story. The long story, and I will make it short.
The medium story.
The medium story,
okay.
Yeah. I am a daughter of an Air Force pilot, or an Air Force, my dad was in the Air Force for years, so I grew up all over the world. And as a child, I was taken to cathedrals and castles and things. So I've seen a lot of this and grew up with that. And I don't think I knew at the time how it affected me, that it really, resonated in me. Plus, I'm an artist. My father was also a woodworker. My mother was a designer. And she did a lot of interiors, and she did a lot of program planning, and so the artistic part of that was in our family household.
And embraced. It sounds like it was not only there, but embraced, and that's an important piece of that.
Oh yeah, and Dad always thought we should be teachers. You should always teach whatever you know for the rest of your life, because somebody out there can learn.
Right.
And lifelong learning was what I grew up with, and hands-on. That is what I've taken with my whole life. Now, add that to the fact that I was born in Kokomo, Indiana, a few blocks from Kokomo, Opalescent Glass.
Okay.
And my mother used to take me to the factory when I was a baby before we were moved to Europe. She said, you just love the colors of glass as a baby. Well, I don't remember that, but
sure.
It just seems like that all adds up.
It does.
And I always tell people and students, always, you don't think about what will influence you, but it will come back to you some way, somehow.
And from the parenting flip side of that, you don't know what is going to stick with your children, so it's worth exposing them to these beautiful treasures, music, art.
And my daughter is in conservation, and and she's more in the environmental end of it, but now she's helping me in the business. So now she's my apprentice. Mm-hmm. So now we have second generation. And my grandchildren now are very much interested in how I put these panels together. They'll come in and they'll go, wow, is that piece, Nana, over here? And was that over there? Yeah. So there are things that they don't realize that I'm influencing them.
Right. And they're going to know at some point. Sure.
So you never know. You don't.
It must feel really special to see that, this is becoming a 3-generation
Yes,
form of art. Would you consider art a craft? I mean, it's more than a craft, because it's also your employment, but you have to be artistic.
It can be both, though.
Okay.
And I always start if I teach a class in stained glass, it's not really stained glass either. It's really art glass.
Right.
And a lot of people use that stained glass term very,
Sure.
for everything. But there's differences in glass, whether it be leaded glass, art glass, sheet glass, stained glass, painted glass, fused glass. So we can really go into the gamut with that. But I think, that influence can be there, and with the 2 and 3 generations, I don't know. We're all artistic, and so I grew up with that with my dad as a hands-on. I mean, he was in the construction field too, so all of the trades backgrounds have been a part of my life, my whole life. I was a teacher. I taught vocational ed. I taught interior design, architecture, and we built houses. That program still is going on in Michigan today, where the high school classes build a house every year.
That's wonderful.
And sell that house. And we didn't just build it. We designed it.
Right.
We put the carpet in. I was a ceramic tile installer for a while. I was a certified kitchen and bath designer for a while. I mean, all these things are things that you take with you and they add together. And the glass just became a part of that.
Right.
It wasn't until a friend of mine brought me a historic piece of glass, and she said, "Could you repair this?" Because I was building new up until that time. Well, yeah, sure, I can try, because Daddy always says, don't ever say can't.
Yeah.
So, sure, took it home, and again, there's your lifelong learning. Everything you touch, especially in historic preservation, somebody else built it, the materials came from somewhere. I respect those crafts traditions.
Absolutely.
It takes special people to be in this field because they have to be passionate about that. That this is something that maybe an immigrant, a German or an Irish person or somebody touched 200 years ago and they made.
Right.
So that's important to me.
And I think some people, they feel that, and it always sounds a little woo-woo when I'm like, I'm not into like necessarily energy or anything, but there's a feeling that you get.
There is.
I do when you touch something.
And you've
that's
talked
so
about that in
old.
talk about that in your podcast. There's that feeling about that. And I think I see that whole circle coming around.
Right.
It wasn't there for a long time, and I'm not saying that we still don't have to educate people.
Sure.
But I think there's.
Do you feel like there's more coming around?
A pendulum is changing.
I think so too.
I really do.
I'm hopeful. I'm really hopeful.
And people are more respectful to maybe wanting some of these artifacts in their houses again, and that kind of thing.
Right.
But so glass has always, again, it's an art medium. I love color. I taught design. So,
sounds like the right fit
so
for you.
it just all happened. Right. And then when I worked at Taliesin, I had an opportunity to work on a piece of his glass there at the house.
Let me introduce that then, because I actually have a question, and then I want to come back to talking about Taliesin if we can. But my question is, your primary job doing restoration work? Okay,
yeah,
so you kind of branched off.
I'd say 98% of what I do is restoration work.
And I mean, I guess this is kind of a silly question to ask.
And I should say restoration and repair.
Okay.
Because a lot is repair.
Right.
I really think I'm more like a surgeon. Mm-hmm. I go in and, I assess what needs to be repaired, and that panel becomes my child for the time that it's with me. And I may go in and pull, it may take apart part of it, and then it go right on in, just like you're a surgeon, and fix the part that needs to be repaired, pull her together. A lot of times I'm talking to it while I'm doing it. And, I'll take, I'm documenting the whole time, and there are times I'll take a picture of something and go, man, I can't show this to the client, because they would just like,
when it's all in pieces, sitting around there, like, what have you done to my window?
Right, and then it's all back together, and then I look at it and go, yes, and you're going home now.
That must be a great feeling to see a piece from start to finish.
Yeah, sure it is.
Do you feel sad? Do you feel hard? Is it hard to let them go? I mean, it's very
difficult, especially when I have a piece for a good 8 weeks.
Right.
Or a job. I just finished up a church in Kentucky, and it's a year and a half. Right. So, you're with those panels. They're 10 windows.
Sure.
10 times 2, 20 windows that are 48 by 36, so, and I'm with each one. Now, some are more cantankerous than others.
Right.
They just will not let me do what I need to do.
Right.
And then others are, they're a breeze to go through. I mean, not a breeze, but, you're just the easier.
Right.
But when you're finished, there is a loss there.
Right.
But then there's, for me, a responsibility. I go around every 2 to 3 years and I check every single job I've ever done. And I make sure everything is fine. And if there needs to be something that has to be done, I do it pro bono. Because I think that's my job and my legacy for the places that I work.
Sure. In this sadness and letting go, is there also a feeling of joy at some point in this process where you've done this incredible piece of work that's going to last? Do you feel that you said you feel a sense of responsibility, which is a bit heavy. So do you ever feel joy about completing a job and contributing back to
I think the joy
world?
is there when you see the client's face.
I imagine.
Because they're the ones that are, oh my goodness.
Yeah, they can't imagine that you could have ever fixed it.
And I'm still standing there going, but then, I'm looking.
You have to let that go.
I know. And
that's an artist thing.
That's an artist thing. But I don't tell them that. It's just part of, or I have sleepless nights over certain things that really bother me. And it's more because it's a challenge and I'm learning all the time, or I have to learn more about that. So, and I don't know. There's things that we talk about in tools and equipment and tips. And, people say, well, do you have any tip for this or that? Well, that happens as you're in the field.
Right. You kind of have to experience it and figure it out.
Experience it.
Sure.
I mean, things that happen to you and you go, oh yeah, I better remember that.
Like a tip. If I said you have a tip, I'd expect you to be like, go slow, take your time. You're not going to be, okay, my tip is this very specific technique because I'm not here and I don't have any glass.
And the tools and equipment that you use in a lot of these trades fields are not, they're no longer around.
Right.
I mean, you almost have to wait till somebody auctions something off, or
that's actually a really good question.
Or you go to a garage sale, or somebody calls you and says, I have a relative that passed away, and I have a basement full of something, and I don't know what it is, but it looks like this, and you go, oh yeah.
I need that tool.
I need this. Or you make your own tools.
Right. That was going to be my question. Do you make your own?
Yeah, I make my own tools. Okay. And of course, I don't like metal against glass a lot. So a lot of things are made out of wood. And I chisel them, or I take them down to the belt sander, and I am a recycler.
Right.
I believe in being, trying to be as best as I can on this earth and keep.
And thank you for that, by the way. Thank you.
That's you're welcome. That's the way I feel.
Right.
And preservation is really about that.
It absolutely is.
So I use things right down to the little nibble, and sand it. But I also have small hands.
This is a small hand. I get it. The small hand problem.
Yeah. The tools are huge. And I'm always looking for the littlest, tiniest tool,
I'm so happy to meet you.
The wire cutters that are small, or I have little tiny hammers, and they're tack hammers. So what are small hammers? Well, the shoesmiths, or the shoe people who repair shoes, have very tiny tack hammers, and those are the ones that I use. So
I always make a joke about my dainty lady hands, because when you go to get gloves, you're like, one size. I'm like, I'm sorry, that is not one size.
No.
That is an extra large size. Yeah. But my grandpa was he was a carpenter by trade. And he was also kind of a small man. He was maybe 5'7" and just real slight. And he had his tools were small. I think it's just in part because he probably got them secondhand and people were smaller for a long time. Right. But I ended up with, especially his hammer. I have other tools that belong to him that I think these just fit my hand.
And if you have to use them all day, I'm with tools all day long. You want them to fit right.
Right. They have to work.
And if they don't, they go off to the side.
Right.
Because it hurts.
Let's pause for just a moment, and we're going to talk really quickly about all the ways that you can support True Tales from Old Houses.
The first way you can help is to spread the word. If you know someone who would love this podcast, tell them about it and explain how and where to listen. You can also share us on social media. Let your friends and family know about us and use the hashtag True Tales from Old Houses. Feel free to tag Stacy and I as well. You can also leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to the podcast. Those ratings and reviews help other people find us and tells them that this is a show worth a listen. And finally, over on our website, truetalesfromoldhouses.com, you can make a one-time or reoccurring monthly donation to the show. Your donations will go directly towards the cost of producing this podcast and creating more engaging and useful content. As a special thank you, if you donate $20 to $25 or more, we will send you a coffee mug with the True Tales from Old Houses logo on it.
We know this is a tricky time, and we do not expect your donations, so anything that you can do to help is greatly appreciated. Without you, there'd be no True Tales from Old Houses. Do you want to talk about the Preservation Trades Network?
Sure.
Go ahead and tell us about what the name of that and what it is.
Well, Preservation Trades Network actually was founded as an organization off of APT, which is Association for Preservation Technology.
Okay.
And a network of craftspeople, artisans, there's architects involved, students of historic preservation, professors of historic preservation, anybody who is really involved with the hands-on trades end of it.
And they have a conference every year, is that
And they have
correct?
a conference every year. It started East Coast based. So we have a lot of Maryland, we have a lot of Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut members. And now there's lots of members that are involved with slate roofers and the Timber Framers Guild, the Slate Roofers Association.
I love that those are things. I love that those are organizations that are out there to help people with these.
But they didn't used to be even 10 years ago.
It's so wonderful.
So it's really wonderful. But this network of people, you can call somebody in the network. I was just emailing Andy DeGrucci out of Pennsylvania the other day, and he's a brick mason, and he has Limeworks products. And I said, hey, Andy, this is a question I have. And of course, I'm using his product. And he's right on there, and that's the great part of this network.
Sure.
And for students to get involved, because when they're in historic preservation by itself is a niche too. It's a small niche of people. So they bring you in. If they find out you're involved, boy, they bring you in, and you can call across the country.
Sure.
And all you have to say is, yes, I'm a student of blah, 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 or I'm in this field, and they'll help you.
Right. I'm going to link to the PTN conference on the show notes, so if anybody's interested in finding out more about that. So I promised that we'd circle back around to Taliesin.
Well, Taliesin is Frank Lloyd Wright's estate. There's about 500 acres. Taliesin means shining brow.
Okay.
And Taliesin was built on the hill or on the brow.
Oh, okay.
There, outside of Spring Green, Wisconsin.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a second because I was going to say that my co-host Devyn, who isn't here today because he's still recovering, he's still on medical leave, he went to Taliesin, and so we had a brief conversation, I think, about it. He was so excited. I said, you won't believe this. Rhonda worked at Taliesin, so now you'll have to tell us what you did and how you got involved in
that. Well, I worked for Taliesin Preservation Commission, and our office was on site, on the estate. And I was a part of the maintenance team, so I was the maintenance coordinator.
Okay.
So I took care of all the cyclical maintenance and routine maintenance, things that needed to be done with the certain buildings on the estate.
Okay, and this wasn't stained glass at the time. This was
this was all
maintenance,
this was
actual maintenance
of all
happen.
The buildings, of all the buildings. So it wasn't just Taliesin home. It was Midway Farm. It was the Hillside School, Tandy Dairy, Romeo and Juliet. All the sites that were on the estate.
And we'll link those in the show notes too, because those may not be familiar just as names, but we'll link those to everything.
And then we had a person that was actually in charge of the work crew that I worked with, and I worked in tandem with him. And then we had a crew of 3 or 4 other people that worked on site. So sometimes I got on site. I mean, I was plastering too, and I was cedar shingling, and we did different things. But I also was in charge of the educational component. So I worked with the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture, and we were pulling in the apprentices that would come for the summer at the Hillside School, and I developed a curriculum where they would work with our crew on the buildings. Because prior to me starting there, I noticed that the students weren't working on the buildings.
I see.
And I thought, well,
We're just talking about learning about working on the buildings.
This is really strange. You're
Sure.
coming here to become an architect, but you're not
Right.
working on the
You're watching other people
very
be-
buildings.
Yes.
Right. And now they have that program.
great.
So
So what was probably the most common maintenance issue with a house
water
like that? Okay, water damage. Gosh, water is just...
water.
Yeah.
We come back to old buildings and we say water, water, water.
Right, and it always wins. Water always wins.
And you have to think about Taliesin's is sitting on the brow,
Sure.
which means that the water comes down the hill,
Right.
under the building, through the building,
Yeah.
and out. So always water issues there.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's relentless, isn't it?
So now my daughter was in junior high school when I started there. So she used to be, think about this, the bus used to drop her off at Taliesin
Taliesin.
after school. And
I
for
love
her, she didn't think anything.
Right.
And she helped Frances Nimpton, who was a Frank Lloyd Wright senior member at the time. Frances has passed now. I have to digress because all of the Frank Lloyd Wright senior members are very dear to me. They are like grandparents to us. And if anybody out there listening to this, if you want to know about Frank Lloyd Wright, you need to read his autobiography. That's Frank Lloyd Wright speaking. That is where you learn about this man.
Sure.
And he says something in his autobiography about Taliesin is like a rubber band. Sometimes you go away from it, but it pulls you and draws you back. And my daughter and I feel that way all the time about that house and about that estate. But she worked on the gardens the whole time that I worked there and was dropped off. And she went to high school in Spring Green and worked and scrubbed the plunge pools there and took care of all the water things. And because the fellowship took us in like their children.
Sounds like a really special childhood for her.
And I believe that's why she's in environmental
Sure.
conservation today, because of that.
That's
so
really interesting. So if you had just a few more minutes to tell...
That's about glass?
Well, you can tell me about anything, because this is really, you've had a long and illustrious career of many facets, to bring it back to glass. But what would you tell people now who might be considering joining the preservation trades, or who might think, the restoration trades are not for me?
Well, I guess I would say that you need to just explore it first, because you're right, it's not for everybody.
Right.
I've had students come into my classes when I used to teach at the college level. They thought this was what they wanted to do. They came in, and one semester they were gone. This is a field where you can't rush everything.
Right.
It takes a long time to do something if you want to do it right and you want to make it quality. I can't turn over glass panels in a couple of days.
Right.
And I don't want to. Now, in the new construction field, you see houses go up very quickly. And I've been in that field too, so it isn't that I haven't been there. I've gone through all of this through different stages. It's a little bit easier, I think, for women now than it was when I
imagine
got
you were a bit
into
of a pioneer at some point.
Well, I was the only one taking shop classes in junior high school, as far as a girl, you know.
Right. I had this
and-
conversation with my mother. Actually, it was kind of funny. I told her, I said, I remember there was one year I really wanted to take shop class, and she wouldn't let me. She made me take home ec. And I thought, why do I need to take home ec? I've been in 4-H for years. You taught me how to cook. Like, I know all of this. She taught me how to sew. And then I said, why can't I take shop class? And I don't know what her reasoning was. But I tell her now today, I said, that shop class, look at what I'm doing with my life. That would have been a lot more useful than taking home ec one more time after having all of that experience given
Except
to me
for
by you
home ec
already.
is good too.
No, I should preface that by saying I think home ec is extremely valuable.
Yeah.
But I'd already cycled through all of that with my mother and with 4-H, and so it was kind of like, just doing it all over again when that.
I think I was lucky to have a father that taught me. I mean, I was painting at age 5.
Right.
And my dad was very, very meticulous. If I was cutting in wrong, he would say, nope, you come back and do it again. Right. And you do it again until you get it right. And so I was lucky to have, I mean, he treated me like a son, even though I was a girl. And I built his wood shops with him. We re-roofed houses every, 20 years. I, installed sidewalks. I mean, I was right alongside of him. So I was lucky in that when I went into shop classes, I had already worked with men and, so I wasn't intimidated. But I think it's a little bit easier today.
Right.
I mean,
I would agree with you.
I really do. For people can do anything they want to do. I don't care who they are. They really can. They just have to have the tenacity and the patience to go along with that. But and glass is the same way. I mean, it really is. I have to have a lot of patience with it. And I'm not a patient person. But
you're forced to be.
But for
Yes.
some reason, I can be that with the glass that's in front of me. So
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking
Thank
this
you.
time and to really arrange this whole trip, which this podcast is just part of. I think we're at 2 full podcasts, 1 mini episode. There's going to be a video component. I mean, this thing, I don't know. This is something new. We've never done this before. And when we put the whole multimedia presentation together, I'm so excited to see how it all shakes out. And you've been a really big part of that. So thank you for helping.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to True Tales from Old Houses. You can find out more about everything we talked about on the show today, including a full transcript over on show notes at truetalesfromoldhouses.com.
Until next time.
Bye for now.